Hello. All right. In this video, we're going to talk about 1910.134, the respiratory protection. And it's a huge standard with lots of appendices, all of which are mandatory. We're going to cover some of them too. So without further ado, let's get going. So here we go. As you can see, at each of these standards, I'm going to show you what you'll find if you look up this on the internet. This is what it shows. Part number 1910, Occupational Safety and Health Standards. 1910, subpart I. Subpart I is personal protective equipment. In this particular standard, 1910.134, respiratory protection. And it has 5 appendices. A is fit testing procedures. That's the only one we're not going to go into because it is extremely long and really technical. So we're not going to do that one. And B1 is a user seal check. That's mandatory. We're going to cover that. B2 is respiratory cleaning, mandatory. We'll cover that. Well, they're all mandatory. C is OSHA respirator medical evaluation questionnaire. We're going to go through it just so you see what it is, not in this video, but in another one. And D is information for employees using respirators but not required under the standard. That's not too long either. We're going to go over all those except for A. So let's get started. This is the biggest one by far. This section applies to general industry, part 1910, shipyards, marine terminals, longshoring, and construction. So you can see that's an unusual standard and that they are saying, usually they start off with exceptions to it, but they're saying this particular standard applies to all of these things. So 1910.34A, very first thing is permissible practices. In the control of those occupational diseases caused by breathing air contaminated with harmful dusts, fogs, fumes, mists, gases, smokes, sprays, or vapors, the primary objective shall be prevent atmospheric contamination. This shall be accomplished as far as feasible by accepting engineering control measures, for example, enclosure or confinement of the operation, general and local ventilation, and substitution of less toxic materials. When effective engineering controls are not feasible or while they are being instituted, appropriate respirators shall be used pursuant to this section. The bold in here is mine because, as you know, in the hierarchy of controls, if the first thing is you get rid of it, completely eliminate it. The next one is substitution. There it is there. The next one down the list is what? Engineering. So you see we're hitting all those. And then this is kind of an administrative controls, which are policies, which is a policy. But of course, this is policy is also the last one on the list, personal protective equipment. It's under PPE, this whole standard. So there we go. A respirator shall be provided to each employee when such equipment is necessary to protect the health of such employee. Makes sense? The employer shall provide the respirators which are applicable and suitable for the purpose intended. Good. That makes sense too. The employer shall be responsible for the establishment and maintenance of a respiratory protection program, which shall include the requirements outlined in paragraph C of this section. The program shall cover each employee required by this section to use a respirator. Now I'm going to hit a bunch of definitions. Following definitions are important terms used in the respiratory protection standard in this section. Air purifying respirator means a respirator with an air purifying filter, cartridge, or canister that removes specific contaminants by passing ambient air through the air purifying element. It actually removes the element. Assigned protection factor means the workplace level of respiratory protection that a respirator or class of respirators is expected to provide to employees when the employer implements a continuing effective respiratory protection program as specified by this section. Atmosphere supplying respirator means a respirator that supplies the respirator user with breathing air from a source independent of the ambient atmosphere and includes supplied air respirators, SARs, and self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA. Canister or cartridge means a container with a filter, sorbent, or catalyst, or combination of these items, which removes specific contaminants from the air passed through the container. Demand respirator means an atmosphere supplying respirator that admits breathing air to the facepiece only when a negative pressure is created inside the facepiece by inhalation. So basically you're inhaling it. So it's a demand because you demand more. Emergency situation means any occurrence such as, but not limited to, equipment failure, rupture of containers, or failure of control equipment that may or does not result in an uncontrolled significant release of an airborne contaminant. Employee exposure means exposure to a concentration of an airborne contaminant that would occur if the employee were not using respiratory protection. End of service life indicator, ESLI, means a system that warns the respirator user of the approach of the end of adequate respiratory protection. For example, that the sorbent is approaching saturation or is no longer effective. Escape-only respirator means a respirator intended to be used only for emergency exits. And at OK Foods, in the engine rooms where a lot of the compressors were for the ammonia, there were escape respirators. So if you were in there and you didn't have anything on and something happened, you could throw that escape respirator on and get out. Filter or air purifying element means a component used in respirators to remove solid or liquid aerosols from the inspired air. Filtering facepiece dust mask means a negative pressure particulate respirator with a filter as an integral part of the facepiece or with the entire facepiece composed of the filtering medium. That's just a dust mask, basically. Fit factor means a quantitative estimate of the fit of a particular respirator to a specific individual, and typically estimates the ratio of the concentration of a substance in ambient air to its concentration inside the respirator when worn. Fit test means the use of a protocol to qualitatively or quantitatively evaluate the fit of a respirator on an individual. We'll see quantitative fit test, QLFT, and quantitative fit test, QNFT. Helmet means a rigid respiratory inlet covering that also provides head protection against impact and penetration. High efficiency particulate air filter, HEPA or HEPA air filter, means a filter that is at least 99.97% efficient in removing monodispersed particles of 0.3 micrometers in diameter. The equivalent NIOSH 42 CFR 84 particulate filters are the N100, R100, and P100 filters. Hood means a respiratory inlet covering that completely covers the head and neck and may also cover portions of the shoulders and torso. Immediately dangerous to life or health, IDLH, means an atmosphere that poses an immediate threat to life, would cause irreversible adverse health effects, or would impair an individual's ability to escape from a dangerous atmosphere. So it's any one of those. So it says or, not and, so any one of those. So in other words, it's immediate threat to life and irreversible adverse health effects or inability to escape. So that's what IDLH means, not just meaning dangerous to life and health. Interior structural firefighting means the physical activity of fire suppression and rescue or both inside of buildings or enclosed structures which are involved in a fire situation beyond the incipient stage. Loose fitting face piece means a respiratory inlet covering that is designed to form a partial seal with the face. Maximum use concentration, MUC, means the maximum atmospheric concentration of a hazardous substance from which an employee can be expected to be protected when wearing a respirator, and is determined by the assigned protection factor of the respirator or class of respirators and the exposure limit of the hazardous substance. The MUC can be determined mathematically by multiplying the assigned protection factor specific for a respirator by the required OSHA permissible exposure limit, short-term exposure limit, or ceiling limit. When no OSHA exposure limit is available for hazardous substance, an employer must determine an MUC on the basis of relevant available information and informed professional judgment. So they're leaving that kind of wide open if they haven't covered it already. So that's what a maximum use concentration is. Negative pressure respirator, tight fitting, means a respirator in which the air pressure inside the face piece is negative during inhalation with respect to the ambient air pressure outside the respirator. Oxygen deficient atmosphere means an atmosphere with an oxygen content below 19.5% by volume. It's always measured by volume. I don't know how else you'd measure it. By weight? I don't think so. Physician or other licensed healthcare professional, PLHCP. So you can see that PLHCP around. Means an individual who's legally permitted scope of practice, so legally permitted for that's license or registration or certification. They have some legal certification to practice this allows him or her to independently provide or be delegated the responsibility to provide some or all of the healthcare services required by paragraph E of this section. A positive pressure respirator means a respirator in which the pressure inside the respirator inlet covering exceeds the ambient air pressure outside the respirator. Powered air purifying respirator means an air purifying respirator that uses the blower to force the ambient air through air purifying elements to the inlet covering. So it forces ambient air through air purifying elements. A pressure demand respirator means a positive pressure atmosphere supplying respirator that admits breathing air to the facepiece when the positive pressure is reduced inside the facepiece by inhalation. Qualitative fit test, QLFT, means a pass-fail fit test to assess the adequacy of respirator fit that relies on the individual's response to the test agent. Quantitative fit test means an assessment of the adequacy of a respirator fit by numerically measuring the amount of leakage into the respirator. And that's basically the basis for your difference in your definition, generally speaking, of qualitative and quantitative. Respiratory inlet covering means that portion of a respirator that forms the protective barrier between the user's respiratory tract and an air purifying device or breathing air source, or both. It may be a facepiece, helmet, hood, suit, or a mouthpiece respirator with nose clamp. Self-contained breathing apparatus means an atmosphere supplying respirator for which the breathing air source is designed to be carried by the user. Service life means the period of time that a respirator, filter, or sorbent, or other respiratory equipment provides adequate protection to the wearer. Supplied air respirator, SAR, or airline respirator. Now they say airline respirator, that means not with airplanes. It means an airline. Has air going through a hose, an airline respirator. Means an atmosphere supplying respirator for which the source of breathing air is not designed to be carried by the user. This section means this respiratory protection standard. Hey, that always means that in every standard, but in this standard, they're telling you it does, okay? Tight-fitting facepiece means a respiratory inlet covering that forms a complete seal with the face. User seal check means an action conducted by the respirator to determine if the respirator is properly seated to the face. That's mandatory. Now, this I'm going to have to, whoops, drop out of this for a second so I can read the top of this. Respiratory protection program. This paragraph requires the employer to develop and implement a written respiratory protection program with required work site specific procedures and elements for required respirator use. The program must be administered by a suitably trained program administrator. In addition, certain program elements may be required for voluntary use to prevent potential hazards associated with the use of a respirator. The Small Entity Compliance Guide contains criteria for the selection of a program administrator and a sample program that meets the requirements of this paragraph. Copies of the Small Entity Compliance Guide will be available on or about April 8, 1998. For C1, in any workplace where respirators are necessary to protect the health of the employee, or whenever respirators are required by the employer shall establish and implement a written respiratory protection program with worksite specific procedures. The program shall be updated as necessary to reflect those changes in workplace conditions that affect respirator use. The employer shall include in the program the following provisions of this section as applicable. Procedures for selecting respirators for use in the workplace. And this is the procedure, okay? Medical evaluations of employees used to use respirators. This is the outlines of the plan. Medical evaluations of employees required to use respirators. Fit testing procedure for tight-fitting respirators. Procedure for proper use of respirators in routine and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. Procedures and schedules for cleaning, disinfecting, storing, inspecting, repairing, discarding, and otherwise maintaining respirators. Procedures to ensure adequate air quality, quantity, and flow of breathing air for atmosphere supplying respirators. Training of employees in the respiratory hazards to which they are potentially exposed during routine and emergency situations. Training of employees in the proper use of respirators, including putting on and removing them, any limitations on their use and their maintenance, and procedures for regularly evaluating the effectiveness of the program. Those are all the elements of the written program that's required under the standard. Where respirator use is not required, an employer may provide respirators at the request of employees or permit employees to use their own respirators if the employer determines that such respirator use will not in itself create a hazard. If the employer determines that any voluntary respirator use is permissible, the employer shall provide the respirator users with the information contained in Appendix D to this section, information for employees using respirators when not required under the standard, and in addition, the employer must establish and implement those elements of a written respiratory protection program necessary to ensure that any employee using a respirator voluntarily is medically able to use that respirator, and that the respirator is clean, stored, and maintained so that its use does not present a health hazard to the user. Now, the exception here is employers are not required to include in a written respiratory protection program those employees who only use of respirators involves the voluntary use of filtering face pieces, in other words, dust masks. The employer shall design a program administrator, designated program administrator, who's qualified by appropriate training or experience that is commensurate with the complexity of the program to administer or oversee the respiratory protection program and conduct the required evaluations of program effectiveness. So somebody has to be in charge of this thing. It's probably going to be somebody in the safety department. The employer shall provide respirators, training, and medical evaluations at no cost to the employee. No surprise there. Selection of respirators. This paragraph requires the employer to evaluate respiratory hazards in the workplace, identify relevant workplace and user factors, and base respirator selection on these factors. The paragraph also specifies appropriately protective respirators for use in IDLH atmospheres and limits the selection and use of air purifying respirators. General requirements: the employer shall select and provide an appropriate respirator based on the respiratory hazards to which the worker was exposed and workplace and user factors that affect respirator performance and reliability. So obviously, before you do this program, you have to know what kind of hazards you're looking at here. The employer shall select a NIOSH certified respirator. The respirator shall be used in compliance with the conditions of its certification. Now, you notice OSHA doesn't approve everything, but NIOSH certainly does. The employer shall identify and evaluate the respiratory hazards in the workplace. This evaluation shall include a reasonable estimate of employee exposures to respiratory hazards and an identification of the contaminant's chemical state and physical form. In other words, this is a gas, whatever. Where the employer cannot identify or reasonably estimate the employee's exposure, the employer shall consider the atmosphere to be IDLH. So if you can't figure out what the exposure is going to be, then you have to assume it's IDLH. And that would be the worst case scenario for exposure. The employer shall select respirators from a sufficient number of respirator models and sizes so that the respirator is acceptable to and correctly fits the users. Now, you don't want to get into respirators with a whole bunch of different the manufacturers, stuff like that. You'll have a nightmare in your hands. You want to try to keep to one model, but different sizes. And because if you don't, you'll have, it'll be a nightmare if this one's wearing this kind and needs these particular canisters. And so, but if you're going to go in a respirator program, you might want to get with somebody in that field and get their input. Respirators for IDLH atmospheres. The employer shall provide the following respirators for employee use in IDLH atmospheres. Respirators provided only for escape from IDLH atmospheres shall be NIOSH certified for escape from the atmosphere in which they will be used. So in other words, an escape respirator for an IDLH atmosphere is only good for the atmosphere which they'll be used, which makes sense. All oxygen deficient atmospheres shall be considered IDLH. Now, as an exception to this, if the employer demonstrates that under all foreseeable conditions, I don't know how you do that, but the oxygen concentration can be maintained within the ranges specified in Table 2 of this section. In other words, for the altitude set out in the table, then any atmosphere supplying respirator may be used. We'll look at the table here in a second. A full face piece pressure demand SCBA certified by NIOSH for a minimum service life of 30 minutes, or a combination full face piece pressure demand air supplied respirator with auxiliary self-contained air supply. respirator provided only for escape from ID. Oops, wrong, I went backwards. Okay, there. That's why the table didn't show up. There's your table 2. All right, there's your altitude, less than 3,001 feet. So you got to know kind of what your altitude is. Oxygen deficient atmosphere, percent of O2, for which the employer may rely on an atmosphere supplying respirators. So it runs from, well, they all stop at 19.5. So the higher up you are, in other words, the higher the bottom of that is. Above 8,000 feet, the exception does not apply. Oxygen-rich breathing air must be supplied above 14,000 feet. So less than 3,000. Basically, you have a little bit lower limit on the oxygen deficient atmosphere if you're at a lower altitude. Higher altitudes, it gets closer to being 19.5, as you can see. Respirators for atmospheres that are not IDLH, the employer shall provide a respirator that is adequate to protect the health of the employee and ensure compliance with all other OSHA statutory and regulatory requirements under routine and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. Routine and reasonable foreseeable emergency situations. You need to have that hashed out amongst yourself or whatever who's doing this to come up with those. Assigned protection factor APFs. Employers must use the assigned protection factors listed in Table 1 to select a respirator that meets or exceeds the required level of employee protection. When using a combination respirator, for instance, an airline respirator with an air purifying filter, employers must ensure that the assigned protection factor is appropriate to the mode of operation in which the respirator is being used. This is your type of respirator, air purifying respirator. These are the assigned protection factors. Half mask, full face piece is 50. Now the highest here is 1,000. You can see that's a power air purifying respirator. That has a full face piece with a full face piece. You can see when you get to these half masks and something, it's not very high. So supplied air respirator. Oh, that's okay. All these 3 are supplied air respirators. Demand mode, continuous flow mode, pressure demand, or other positive mode. You got some good numbers here. And that's a loose fitting face piece, and this is the helmet hood. Pressure demand, and this is self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA. Demand mode is 50. Positive pressure demand or other positive pressure mode is 10,000. Wow. Employers may select respirators assigned to the workplace. Concentrate. Assign. Let me get this down so I can read it all. Make sure I get it right. Employers may select respirators assigned for use in higher workplace concentrations of a hazardous substance for use at lower concentrations of that substance, or when required respirator use is independent of concentration. So you can use a respirator device that's higher, and that makes sense. I mean, it's safer than something. That's pretty standard. The assigned protection factors in Table 1 are only effective when an employer implements a continuing effective respirator program as defined by this section, including training, fit testing, maintenance, and use, of course. This APF category includes filtering face pieces and half masks with elastomeric face pieces. The employer must have evidence provided by the respirator manufacturer. The testing of these respirators demonstrates performance at a level of protection of 1,000 or greater to receive an APF of 1,000. This level of performance can best be demonstrated by performing a WPF or SWPF study or equivalent testing. Absent such testing, all other PAPRs and SARs with helmets hoods are to be treated as loose-fitting face pieces, respirators, and receive an APF of 25. These APFs do not apply to respirators used solely for escape. For escape respirators used in association with specific substances covered by 29 CFR 1910 subpart Z, employers must refer to the appropriate substance-specific standards in that subpart. Escape respirators for other IDLH atmospheres are specified by the standard. Maximum use concentration. The employer must select a respirator for employee use that maintains the employee's exposure to the hazardous substance when measured outside the respirator at or below the maximum use concentration. Employers must not apply MUCs to conditions that are immediately dangerous to life or health. Instead, they must use respirators listed for IDLH conditions in paragraph D2 of this standard. When the calculated MUC exceeds the IDH level for a hazardous substance, or the performance of the limits of the cartridge or canister, then employers must set the maximum MUC at that lower limit. The respirator selected shall be appropriate for the chemical state and physical form of that contaminant. For protection against gases and vapors, the employer shall provide an atmosphere supplying respirators or an air purifying respirator, provided that the respirator is equipped with an end of service light indicator certified by NIOSH for the contaminant. And problem with ESLIs is, I think, pretty sure they're not available for every contaminant. So you have to be careful with those, the end of service light indicator. If there's no ESLI appropriate for conditions in the employer's workplace, the employer implements a change schedule for canisters and cartridges that is based on objective information or data that will ensure that canisters and cartridges are changed before the end of their service life. The employer shall describe in the respirator program the information and data relied upon and the basis for the canister and cartridge change schedule and the basis for reliance on the data. So you got to look at what the manufacturer says, the concentrations that you're expecting, concentrations you come into, and figure out when to change these canisters or cartridges. Because sooner or later, all canisters or cartridge are going to be saturated or become ineffective. In that case, it can be very dangerous. For protection against particulates, the employer shall provide an atmosphere supplying respirator or an air purifying respirator equipped with a filter certified by NIOSH under 30 CFR Part 11 as a high efficiency particulate air HEPA filter, or an air purifying respirator equipped with a filter certified for particulates by NIOSH under 42 CFR Part 84, or for contaminants consisting primarily of particles with mass median aerodynamic diameters, MMAD, of at least 2 micrometers, an air purifying respirator equipped with any filter certified for particulates by NIOSH. Medical evaluation. Using a respirator may place a physiological burden on employees that varies with the type of respirator worn, the job and workplace conditions in which the respirator is used, and the medical status of the employee. Accordingly, this paragraph specifies the minimum requirements for medical evaluation that employers must implement to determine the employee's ability to use a respirator. General, the employer shall provide a medical evaluation to determine the employee's ability to use a respirator before the employee is fit tested or required to use the respirator in the workplace. So it's even before they're fit tested. The employer may discontinue an employee's medical evaluations when the employee is no longer required to use a respirator. Well, that makes sense. Medical evaluation procedures. The employer shall identify a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, PLHCP, to perform medical evaluations using a medical questionnaire or an initial medical examination that obtains the same information as the medical questionnaire. The medical evaluation shall obtain the information requested by the questionnaire in sections 1 and 2, Part A of Appendix C of this section. And we'll talk about that later. We'll go over it. Not in this video, but another one. Follow-up medical examination. The employer shall ensure that a follow-up medical examination is provided for an employee who gives a positive response to any question among questions 1 through 8 in Section 2, Part A of Appendix C, or whose initial medical examination demonstrates the need for a follow-up medical examination. A lot of times the doctor will tell you that too. The follow-up medical examination shall include any medical tests, consultations, or diagnostic procedures that the PLHCP deems necessary to make a final determination. So they might have to put it through some tests, which is reasonable. Administration of the medical questionnaire and examinations. The medical questionnaire and examinations shall be administered confidentially during the employee's normal working hours or at a time and place convenient to the employee. The medical questionnaire shall be administered in a manner that ensures that the employee understands its contents. The employer shall provide the employee with an opportunity to discuss the questionnaire and examination results with the PLHCP. Supplemental information for the PLHCP. The following information must be provided to the PLHCP before the PLHCP makes a recommendation concerning an employee's ability to use a respirator. So they're going to base their ability to use respirator not just on the examination, but also on what these questions are here. The type and weight of the respirator to be used by the employee, the duration and frequency of respirator use, including use for rescue and escape, the expected physical work effort, additional protective clothing and equipment that to be worn, the temperature and humidity extremes that may be encountered. So any supplemental information provided previously to the PLHCP regarding an employee need not be provided for subsequent medical evaluation if the information and the PLHCP remain the same. In other words, if you've given them this information about what we just mentioned for the PLHCP, and next year when they have it, you don't have to give it again if it's the same PLHCP. The employer shall provide the PLHCP with a copy of the written respiratory protection program and a copy of this section. Okay, so you have to give them a copy of this 134 and a copy of your program too. Note to paragraph E5 III. When the employer replaces the PLHCP, the employer must ensure that the new PLHCP obtains this information, either by providing the documents directly to the PLHCP or having the documents transferred from the former PLHCP to the new PLHCP. However, OSHA does not expect employers to have employees medically reevaluated solely because a new PLHCP has been selected. That's good that they put something like that in there, because that would come up. Medical determination. In determining the employee's ability to use a respirator, the employer shall obtain a written recommendation regarding the employee's ability to use a respirator from the PLHCP. So it has to be in writing. They can't call you by the phone. Yeah, he's okay. Nope, got to be in writing. The recommendation shall provide only the following information: any limitations on respirator use related to the medical condition of the employee or relating to the workplace conditions in which the respirator will be used, including whether or not the employee is medically able to use the respirator, and if need, if any, for follow-up medical evaluations, and a statement that the PLHCP has provided the employee with a copy of the PLHCP's written recommendation. So if the respirator is a negative pressure respirator and the PLHCP finds a medical condition that may place the employee's health at increased risk if the respirator is used, the employer shall provide a PAPR if the PLHCP medical evaluation finds that the employee can use such a respirator. If a subsequent medical evaluation finds that the employee is medically able to use a negative pressure respirator, then the employer is no longer required to provide a PAPR. Additional medical evaluations. At a minimum, the employer shall provide additional medical evaluations to comply with the requirements of this section if an employee reports medical signs or symptoms that are related to the ability to use a respirator. That's if the employee reports, okay? A PLHCP, a supervisor, or the respirator program administrator informs the employer that an employee needs to be reevaluated. Information from the respiratory protection program, including observations made during fit testing and program evaluation, indicate a need for employee reevaluation. A change occurs in workplace conditions, physical work effort, protective clothing, temperature, etc., that may result in a substantial increase in the physiological burden placed on an employee. That makes a lot of sense. This paragraph requires that before an employee may be required to use any respirator with a negative or positive pressure tight-fitting facepiece, the employee must be fit tested with the same make, model, style, and size of respirator that will be used. This paragraph specifies the kinds of fit tests allowed, the procedures for conducting them, and how the results of the fit tests must be used. The employer shall ensure that employees using a tight-fitting facepiece respirator pass an appropriate qualitative fit test, QLFT, or quantitative fit test, QNFT, as stated in this paragraph. The employer shall ensure that an employee using a tight-fitting facepiece respirator is fit tested prior to its initial use of the respirator, whenever a different respirator facepiece, size, style, model, or make is used, and at least annually thereafter. So fit testing is annual after the initial. The employer shall conduct an additional fit test whenever the employee reports or the employer, PLHCP, supervisor, or program administrator makes visual observations of changes in the employee's physical condition that could affect respirator fit. So such conditions include, but are not limited to, facial scarring, dental changes, cosmetic surgery, or an obvious change in body weight. So those conditions could affect how that's going to fit you. So you might have to be fit tested again if you put on a lot of weight or lose a lot of weight, or you have dental changes. I mean, I see where that could work. That could be. If after passing a QLFT or QNFT, the employee subsequently notifies the employer, program administrator, supervisor, or PLHCP that the fit of the respirator is unacceptable, the employee shall be given a reasonable opportunity to select a different respirator face piece and to be retested. So the employee says, wait, this isn't working. I'm still getting some problems here. By all means, you've got to accommodate them. The fit test shall be administered using an OSHA accepted QLFT or QNFT protocol. You notice they say OSHA accepted. Not OSHA approved, but OSHA accepted. The OSHA accepted QLFT, QNFT protocols and procedures are contained in Appendix A of this section. And that one is really, really long and covers a lot of different things. And that's why we're not going to cover here. But I suggest you look in it and read it. 1910 F6 QLFT may only be used to fit test negative pressure air purifying respirators that must achieve a fit factor of 100 or less. If the fit factor as determined through an OSHA accepted QNFT protocol is equal to or greater than 100 for tight fitting half face pieces, or equal to or greater than 500 for tight fitting full face pieces, the QNFT has been passed with that respirator. In other words, you got to use that respirator then. Fit testing of tight fitting atmosphere supplying respirators and tight fitting powered air purifying respirators shall be accomplished by performing quantitative or qualitative fit testing in the negative pressure mode, regardless of the mode of operation, negative or positive pressure, that is used for respiratory protection. Qualitative fit testing of these respirators shall be accomplished by temporarily converting the respirator user's actual face piece into a negative pressure respirator with appropriate filters, or by using an identical negative pressure air purifying respirator face piece with the same sealing surfaces as a surrogate for the atmosphere supplying or powered air purifying respirator face piece. Quantitative fit testing of these respirators shall be accomplished by modifying the face pieces to allow sampling inside the face piece in the breathing zone of the user, midway between the nose and mouth. This requirement shall be accomplished by installing a permanent sampling probe into a surrogate face piece, or by using a sampling adapter designed to temporarily provide a means of sampling air from inside the face piece. Any modification to the respirator face piece for fit testing shall be completely removed and the face piece restored to NIOSH approved configuration before that face piece can be used in the workplace. Use of respirators. This paragraph requires employers to establish and implement procedures for the proper use of respirators. These requirements include prohibiting conditions that may result in face piece seal leakage, preventing employees from removing respirators in hazardous environments, taking actions to ensure continued effective respirator operation throughout the work shift, and establishing procedures for the use of respirators in IDLH atmospheres or in interior structural firefighting situations. Face piece seal protection. The employer shall not permit respirators with tight-fitting face pieces to be worn by employees who have, okay, this is important, this is going to come up. The employer shall not permit respirators with tight-fitting face pieces, which are probably the most common ones, to be worn by employees who have facial hair that comes between the sealing surface of the face piece and the face, or that interferes with valve function, or any condition that interferes with the face-to-face piece seal or valve function. Now, the face piece fits around like this. A lot of times they'll let you have a goatee and a mustache if it doesn't interfere with the seal. A lot of people just won't let you have any facial hair at all. If an employee wears corrective glasses or goggles or other personal protective equipment, the employer shall ensure that such equipment is worn in a manner that does not interfere with the seal of the face piece to the face of the user. For all tight-fitting respirators, the employer shall ensure that employees perform a user seal check each time they put on their respirator using the procedures in Appendix B1, or procedures recommended by the respirator manufacturer that the employer demonstrates are as effective as those in Appendix B1 of the section. We're going to cover that in a separate video. But the employer shall ensure that they do that every time they put them on. Appropriate surveillance shall be maintained of work area conditions and degree of employee exposure or stress. When there is a change in work area conditions or degree of employee exposure or stress that may affect respirator effectiveness, the employer shall reevaluate the continued effectiveness of the respirator. The employer shall ensure that employees leave the respirator use area to wash their faces and respirator face pieces as necessary to prevent eye or skin irritation associated with respirator use, or if they detect vapor or gas breakthrough, changes in breathing resistance, or leakage of the face piece. Or to replace the respirator or the filter, cartridge, or canister elements. If the employee detects vapor or gas breakthrough, changes in breathing resistance, or leakage of the face piece, the employer must replace or repair the respirator before allowing the employee to return to the work area. Procedure for IDLH atmospheres. For all IDLH atmospheres, the employer shall ensure that one employee, or when needed, more than one employee is located outside the IDLH atmosphere. Visual, voice, or signal line communications is maintained between the employees in the IDLH atmosphere and the employees located outside the IDLH atmosphere. The employees located outside the IDLH atmosphere are trained and equipped to provide effective emergency rescue. The employer or designee is notified before the employees located outside the IDLH atmosphere enter the IDLH atmosphere to provide emergency rescue. The employer or designee authorized to do so by the employer, once notified, provides necessary assistance appropriate to the situation. Employees located outside the IDLH atmospheres are equipped with pressure demand or other positive pressure SCBAs, or a pressure demand or other positive pressure supplied air respirator with an auxiliary SPA, and either appropriate retrieval equipment for removing the employees who enter these hazardous atmospheres, where retrieval equipment would contribute to the rescue of the employees and would not increase the overall risk resulting from entry, or equivalent means for rescue where retrieval equipment is not required under paragraph B. What we did at OK Foods, we had fortunately, we never had to do this in a live situation, but with training, we had to have 2 people fully dressed up in SCBAs and full suits, level A suits and SCBAs, to go into a potential ammonia release. And we had to have 2 people fully ready to go, backing them up right outside the door or whatever. Now, ammonia IDLH is 300 parts per million. That's going to be achieved pretty quickly in any significant ammonia release. So they're going to be in an IDLH. So we had 2 people going in, 2 people going out. So you had to have 4 people fully trained, fully qualified, fully fit test, everything else to do a potential, not just a rescue, but potential entering someplace to stop an ammonia release, because you couldn't go into the engine room or wherever it was to do it unless you had 2 people going in and 2 people on the outside, just like it I said here. Procedures for interior structural firefighting. In addition to requirements set forth under paragraph G3 in interior structural fires, the employer shall ensure that at least 2 employees enter the IDLH atmosphere and remain in visual or voice contact with one another at all times. At least 2 employees are located outside the IDLH atmosphere, and all employees engaged in interior structural firefighting use SCBAs. Note paragraph G, and the paragraph G was right here. One of the 2 individuals located outside the IDLH atmosphere may be assigned to an additional role, such as the incident commander in charge of the emergency or the safety officer, so long as this individual is able to perform assistance or rescue activities without jeopardizing the safety or health of any firefighter working at the incident. And nothing in this section is meant to preclude firefighters from performing emergency rescue activities before an entire team has assembled. In other words, you're giving the firefighters free rein to go in if they have to. And that's kind of what the firefighters are going to do anyhow. Maintenance and care of respirators. This paragraph requires the employer to provide for the cleaning and disinfecting, storage, inspection, and repair of respirators used by employees. Cleaning and disinfecting, the employer shall provide each respirator user with a respirator that is clean, sanitary, and in good working order. The employer shall ensure that respirators are cleaned and disinfected using the procedures in Appendix B2 of this section, which we'll talk about in a separate video, or procedures recommended by the respirator manufacturer, provided that such procedures are of equivalent effectiveness. The respirators shall be cleaned and disinfected at the following intervals. Respirators issued for the exclusive use of an employee shall be cleaned and disinfected as often as necessary to be maintained in a sanitary condition. Respirators issued to more than one employee shall be cleaned and disinfected before being worn by different individuals. So if you got your own, then it's just to maintain a sanitary condition. But if you're shared one, that has to be done before being worn by different individuals. It doesn't say immediately before, so I think probably the best thing would do would be have it be clean after it's being used, so you didn't have to do it while you're getting suited up for an emergency. Respirators maintained for emergency use shall be cleaned and disinfected after each use, and respirators used in fit testing and training shall be cleaned and disinfected after each use. The employer shall ensure that respirators are stored as follows. All respirators shall be stored to protect them from damage, contamination, dust, sunlight, extreme temperatures, excessive moisture, and damaging chemicals, and they shall be packed or stored to prevent deformation of the facepiece and exhalation valve. So you don't want to store them in where there could be sunlight because they've got some neoprene or rubber, whatever it is on it, it could be damaged. And you don't want to have them smashed down, so you pick them up, they're all bent out of shape. In addition to the requirements of paragraph H2I, emergency respirators will be kept accessible to the work area, stored in compartments or in covers that are clearly marked as containing emergency respirators, and stored in accordance with any applicable manufacturer's instructions. And that's the way we did it at OK Foods. The emergency respirator was stored in a box, kind of, with it stated on emergency respirator, had a glass or cover, a clear cover, so you could see it was in there. And there's your applicable manufacturer's instructions again. Inspection. The employer shall ensure that respirators are inspected as follows. All respirators used in routine situations shall be inspected before each use and during cleaning. Routine situations, okay. All respirators maintained for use in emergency situations shall be inspected at least monthly and in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations, and shall be checked for proper function before and after each use. And emergency escape only respirators shall be inspected before being carried into the workplace for use. The employer shall ensure that respirator inspections include the following: check of respirator function, tightness of connections, and the condition of the various parts, including but not limited to the facepiece, head straps, valves, connecting tube, cartridges, canisters, or filters, and a check of elastomeric parts for pliability and signs of deterioration. In addition to the requirements of paragraphs H3I and II of this section, self-contained breathing apparatus shall be inspected monthly. Air and oxygen cylinders shall be maintained in a fully charged state and shall be recharged when the pressure falls to 90% of the manufacturer's recommended pressure level. The employer shall determine that the regulator and warning functions function properly. For respirators maintained for emergency use, the employer shall certify the respirator by documenting the date the inspection was performed, the name or signature of the person who made the inspection, the findings, required remedial action, and a serial number or other means of identifying the inspected respirator, and provide this information on a tag or label that is attached to the storage compartment for the respirator, is kept with the respirator, or is included in inspection reports stored as paper or electronic files. This information shall be maintained until replaced following a subsequent certification. The employer shall ensure that respirators that fail an inspection or are otherwise found to be defective are removed from service and are discarded or repaired or adjusted in accordance with the following procedures. Repairs or adjustments to respirators are to be made only by persons appropriately trained to perform such operations and shall use only the respirator manufacturer's NIOSH approved parts designed for the respirator. Now, I don't know why you want to do anything else. If you're using a certain ABC respirator, why you'd want to buy any kind of other parts is beyond me, but I'm glad they put that in there. Repairs shall be made according to the manufacturer's recommendations and specifications for the type and extent of repairs to be performed, and reducing and admission valves, regulators, and alarms shall be adjusted or repaired only by the manufacturer or a technician trained by the manufacturer. That's really good, important. That's good stuff too to know there. Breathing air quality and use. This paragraph requires the employer to provide employees using atmosphere supplied respirators, supplied air and SCBA with breathing gases of high purity. The employer shall ensure that compressed air, compressed oxygen, liquid air, and liquid oxygen used for respiration accords with the following specifications. Compressed and liquid oxygen shall meet the United States Pharmacopoeia requirements for all medical and breathing oxygen, and compressed breathing air shall meet at least the requirements for grade D breathing air described in ANSI Compressed Gas Association commodity specification for air, to include oxygen content of 19.5 to 23.5%, hydrocarbon condensed content of 5 milligrams per cubic meter of air or less, and carbon monoxide content of 10 parts per million or less. Carbon dioxide content of 1,000 parts per million or less, and lack of a noticeable odor. The employer shall ensure that compressed oxygen is not used in atmosphere supplying respirators that have previously used compressed air. The employer shall ensure that oxygen concentrations greater than 23.5% are used only in equipment designed for oxygen service or distribution. The employer shall ensure that cylinders used to supply breathing air to respirators meet the following requirements. Cylinders are tested and maintained as prescribed in the shipping container specification regulations of DOT 39 CFR 49 CFR Part 180. Cylinders of purchased breathing air have a certificate of analysis from the supplier and that the breathing air meets the requirements of grade D breathing air, and the moisture content in the cylinder does not exceed a dew point of minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 atmospheric pressure. We had our things, there was a scuba outfit in Fort Smith, and we had our SCBAs refilled there. And when we did, every time we did, we got a certificate analysis on the air that was put in them. So the employer shall ensure that compressors used to supply breathing air to respirators are constructed and situated as to prevent entry of contaminated air in the air supply system, minimize moisture content so that the dew point at 1 atmospheric pressure is 10 degrees Fahrenheit below the ambient temperature, have suitable inline air purifying sorbent beds and filters to further ensure breathing air quality. Sorbent beds and filters shall be maintained and replaced or refurbished periodically following the manufacturer's instructions. Have a tag containing the most recent change date and the signature of the person authorized by the employer to perform the change. The tag shall be maintained at the compressor. For compressors that are not oil lubricated, the employer shall ensure that carbon monoxide levels in the breathing air do not exceed 10 parts per million. For oil lubricated compressors, the employer shall use a high temperature or carbon monoxide alarm or both to monitor carbon monoxide levels. If only high temperature alarms are used, the air supply shall be monitored at intervals sufficient to prevent carbon monoxide in the breathing air from exceeding 10 parts per million. The employer shall assure that breathing air couplings are incompatible with outlets for non-respirable worksite air or other gas systems. No asphyxiating substances shall be introduced into breathing air lines. The employer shall use only the respirator manufacturer's NIOSH-approved breathing gas containers marked and maintained in accordance with the quality assurance provisions of the NIOSH approval for the SCBA as issued in accordance with the NIOSH respirator certification standard at 42 CFR Part 84. Identification of filters, cartridges, and canisters. The employer shall ensure that all filters, cartridges, and canisters used in the workplace are labeled and color-coded with the NIOSH approval label, and the label is not removed and remains legible. Training and information. This paragraph requires the employer to provide effective training to employees who are required to use respirators. The training must be comprehensive, understandable, and recur annually, and more often if necessary. This paragraph also requires the employer to provide the basic information on respirators in Appendix D of this section to employees who wear respirators when not required by this section or by the employer to do so. We'll talk about Appendix D in another video. The employer shall ensure that each employee can demonstrate knowledge of at least the following: why the respirator is necessary and how improper fit, usage, or maintenance can compromise the protective effect of the respirator, what the limitations and capabilities of the respirator are, how to use the respirator effectively in emergency situations, including situations in which the respirator malfunctions, how to inspect, put on and remove, use, and check the seals of the respirator, what the procedures are for maintenance and storage of the respirator, how to recognize medical signs and symptoms that may limit or prevent the effective use of respirators, and the general requirements of this section. The training shall be conducted in a manner that is understandable to the employee. The employer shall provide the training prior to requiring the employee to use a respirator in the workplace. An employer who is able to demonstrate that a new employee has received training in the last 12 months that addresses the elements specified in K1I through VII is not required to repeat such training, provided that, as required by K1, the employee can demonstrate knowledge of these elements. Previous training not repeated initially by the employer must be provided later than 12 months from the date of the previous training. You know what? I wouldn't do that. If it was me, I would say, I don't care what you had. If you had previous training, good, you'll catch on quicker, maybe faster, but we're going to go through the training with you because I'm not sure how that training was done. Retraining shall be administered annually and when the following situations occur: changes in the workplace or the type of respirator render previous training obsolete. Where have we heard that before? Inadequacies in the employee's knowledge or use of the respirator indicate the employee has not retained the requisite understanding or skill. Where we heard that before, or any other situation arises in which retraining appears necessary to ensure safe respirator use. We don't usually see that particular that particular wording in a standard, but it is in this one because it's so important. The basic advisory information on respirators, as presented in Appendix D of this section, shall be provided by the employer in any written or oral format to employees who wear respirators when such use is not required by this section or by the employer. Program evaluation. This section requires the employer to conduct evaluations of the workplace to ensure that the written respiratory protection program is being properly implemented and to consult employees to ensure that they are using the respirators properly. The employer shall conduct evaluations of the workplace as necessary to ensure that the provisions of the current written program are being effectively implemented and that it continues to be effective. The employer shall regularly consult employees required to use respirators to assess the employee's views on program effectiveness and to identify any problems. Any problems that are identified during this assessment shall be corrected. Factors to be assessed include, but are not limited to, respirator fit, including the ability to use the respirator without interfering with effective workplace performance, appropriate respirator selection for the hazards to which the employee is exposed, proper respirator use under the workplace conditions in which the employee encounters, and proper respirator maintenance. Talk to your employees. I say that a lot. Talk to your employees. They know more about what's going on than you're going to know, or maybe what even their bosses know. Record keeping. This section requires the employer to establish and maintain written information regarding medical evaluations, fit testing, and the respirator program. This information will facilitate employee involvement in the respirator program, assist the employer in auditing the adequacy of the program, and provide a record for compliance determinations by OSHA. Medical evaluation. Records of medical evaluation required by this section must be retained and made available in accordance with 29 CFR 1910-1020. Fit testing. The employer shall establish a record of the qualitative and quantitative fit tests administered in an employee, including the name or identification of the employee tested, the type of fit test performed, the specific make, model, style, and size of respirator tested, date of test, and the pass-fail results for QLFTs, or the fit factor and strip chart recording or other recording of the test for QNFTs. Fit test records shall be retained for respirator users until the next fit test is administered. A written copy of the current respirator program shall be retained by the employer. A written copy of the current respirator shall be retained by the employer. Duh. A fit test gets you, if you have to do fit testing, I strongly suggest you get a port account for fit testing. Written materials required to be retained under this paragraph shall be made available upon request to affected employees and to the assistant secretary or designee for examination and copying. They put this in there so they make sure they have when somebody knocks on your OSHA inspector knocks on your door, they're representing the assistant secretary. That's what they're that's why they put that in there. Effective date, paragraph D3IA and B of this section become effective November 22nd, 2006. Appendices 1910-34O. Appendices compliance with Appendix A and Appendix B, 1, B2, C, and D are mandatory. That's all. Isn't that enough? As you can see, a respiratory program is very, very detailed, and it's a lot of work, but it can be done, and it takes a lot of probably the safety department following up on it, making sure it's done right, in cooperation with whoever it is, the maintenance department, the refrigeration department, whoever the people are actually wearing them. And there should be that cooperation anyhow. And I've said it many, many times before, communication with the safety department and not just the employees, including management, supervisors, and stuff like that. You got to be there. You got to be around. They got to know who you are. You have to show up. You have to care, and you have to make sure that they know that you care. And then they'll tell you things that will they wouldn't otherwise tell you if you didn't show up and have an interest in what they're doing and have an interest in their safety. And that interest has to be led by the safety department. Well, that's enough for this time. Be safe.